I had this experience back in 2020. Everyone was holed up in their houses as the world shut down due to COVID. As a passionate camper and traveler, I took advantage of COVID to visit many national parks and set up tents in various locations. A watercourse in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park was one of the locations. Without identifying myself or disclosing too much personal information, let's just say that in 2019, something occurred at work that somewhat damaged my reputation. There were plenty of folks who hated me. I finally resigned from my work, got a new phone number, and had to move residences. The criticism was to be anticipated, given my error resulted in significant financial losses for a considerable number of individuals. I just had no idea how far it would go. For a time, I was really being plagued by various random numbers. There were also some threatening messages. I thought about the potential that it may be a single individual messaging me from a lot of different numbers, but I wasn't sure whether they were from the same person or new individuals each time. I was relieved that folks appeared to lose interest or just walk on since it seemed to cease for a bit. This time, I wasn't working. Instead, I was taking some time to relax, which is why I was visiting several national parks. I parked my vehicle, drove the 3 hours to Rocky Mountain National Park, and began hiking up the route to the brook. No one else was present. That was probably because people were taking the lockdown extremely seriously at the time and were staying inside their homes. In addition to that, it was still winter. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow, which was solid enough to produce a loud crunching sound with each step. It took me a short time to reach the brook. It was still flowing. It wasn't frozen. I needed a cleanse from the worries of my life at the time, and this place was wonderfully tranquil. I located a spot to camp a little distance from the trail. I prepared the tent, cut up some wood, built a fire, and used the stove to cook some sausages. I then settled down by the fire to read my book. It was becoming dark outside after completing many chapters. I'm grateful for headlights. I rolled a joint and took a puff. I felt my phone start to go off after a few hits. Since I don't get many messages from individuals other than my family, I took my phone out of my jacket pocket and discovered a number of texts from an unknown number. When I realized it was occurring again, my heart skipped a beat. I checked it up and found that the messages were from a number with the area code 203, which is Connecticut. "How's your camping going, buddy?" was the text message I received from whomever it was. "Out here, it's beautiful," the second text said. "I understand why you came up here," the third text stated. My first instinct was to say, "Who is this?" What if they had just said, "How's the camping going?" I would have thought it was a relative. However, they were communicating with me as if they were present. I was high, and the pot had already gotten into my system. My anxiousness was not at all reduced by this. I became quite nervous and began scanning my surroundings. I got up and turned around, gazing in all directions and into the darker woods. To feel safer, I proceeded to get my .365 pistol from my luggage. Normally, I would extinguish a fire before going to bed, but even with my current level of paranoia, the idea of being completely in the dark terrified me. I got onto my sleeping bag after entering the tent. In anticipation of a response, which never materialized, I gazed at the messages on my phone. I honestly simply wanted the cannabis to go away as the minutes passed slowly. I attempted to pick up where I left off in my book, still using my lantern. However, I was deluding myself by believing I could read since I was high and my thoughts were focused on those letters. To kill time, I chose to do nothing but watch YouTube videos on my phone. I was not yet at ease enough to go to sleep. On YouTube, I was watching a murder documentary. I know, a somewhat intriguing choice given the context. I received an answer to my previous inquiry in a surprise text message. "No longer matters," they retorted. My heart began pounding once again. "How did you know I'm camping?" I retorted. Again, however, no answer. This situation's anxiousness was getting to me more and more. Was a friend or relative pulling a practical joke? Or was I being harassed by this person once more? However, how would they be aware that I'm camping if it were the latter? That's where the discomfort lies. The fire outside was dying down to nearly nothing, and I observed that the light was becoming dimmer and dimmer while I spent an hour viewing movies on my phone. The only sound in the woods during the winter, apart from the wind on a stormy night, is the absence of insects. The quiet would get unbearable as soon as the video stopped playing. Normally, I would welcome the calm, but these letters totally upended my tranquility. Then the distinct sound of footsteps in the snow disturbed the stillness. They moved closer until they were about 6 feet from the outside of my tent. Then the footsteps ceased. I held the rifle firmly in my palm, prepared to deactivate the safety. Suddenly, a flash came from outside. It seemed as if someone snapped a photo of the tent or momentarily shone a torch at it. I quickly received my response. The person's footsteps gradually faded to quiet before I heard them leave. In the back of my mind, I anticipated that my phone would vibrate and dinge. I got a picture from that number. It was a picture of my tent. A text message that said, "Have a good night's sleep," came next. I don't know why, but all of a sudden I felt as if I had fully snapped out of the rest of my high, and I was overcome with confidence and exhilaration. I fired 2 shots into the air after unzipping the tent. I knew it was effective because I could hear footsteps rushing away in the snow not too far away, scaring the person away. That would imply that they were still lurking and observing from a distance, which further unsettled me. I went back inside my tent and yelled a menace into the air. Since there were no more messages or footsteps, I think it was successful. For the simple reason that the incident woke me up entirely, I remained awake for hours thereafter. It was as if I had 3 glasses of coffee. I did eventually fall asleep, and it was a great relief to wake up to the early sun. I wasn't prepared to draw a pistol on whomever had followed me there. I certainly don't seem to be the kind of guy who would own a firearm. I haven't shot the gun since I bought it, and it was the only time I've ever done so. I haven't been harassed for over 5 years, so whomever was messaging, pestering, and seemingly following me evidently chose to stop when they learned I possessed a gun. It was a terrifying night, however, and I can't even begin to picture how things could have gone if I hadn't been carrying a weapon. I continue to wonder what is genuine and what isn't after this story. My dad and I experienced it, and even now, 2 years later, the thought still shivers me. I get how that sounds. I wouldn't believe it either if I were you. But every phrase is true, I promise you. I went camping with my dad 2 years ago at a location in the deep woods. We liked doing this since it was often a great way to escape from everyday life. This location in particular was pleasant, with zip lines and hiking paths. It was a little touristic, but it had a rich past. You know, Native American lands. It was a fantastic first night. The type of quiet night you go camping for. Kids laughing, campfires everywhere, families at nearby campgrounds. We opened a few beers, toasted marshmallows, prepared hot dogs, and struck up conversations with others in our immediate vicinity. A normal quiet first night. However, things began to shift on the second night. We were informed by the personnel that we were the only visitors to the park. No one else had reserved a spot. We were excited at first since we had the whole campsite to ourselves. It had a serene tone. We took things leisurely, went fishing, and hiked all day. We once sat by the river and listened to a creepy podcast because, well, why not embrace the eerie atmosphere? We believed we were amusing ourselves. We were feeling fantastic by the time the sun began to drop. We were a bit intoxicated from the beers and exhausted in that nice way that comes after spending a long day outside. Before it became too dark, we made the decision to walk to the park's information center to get some refreshments and charge our phones. The uneasiness began on the way back to our tent. The woods had a new feel. The air had more weight. The sky had a strange color, as if twilight was reluctant to go. "Doesn't this feel off?" my dad said, turning to face me, as if we were in a dream of some kind. It did, and he was correct. The jungle seemed to go on forever, in all directions. My chest constricted. The sense that we weren't alone persisted in my mind. After that, we didn't say much and just continued to walk while looking over our shoulders as if we thought we could see something hiding in the woods. We remained near the fire at camp. We didn't need to discuss the strange sensation, so we didn't. It seemed as if we both decided in silence to maintain the status quo and act as though nothing was amiss. In an attempt to divert our attention, we smoked some marijuana, played music, and toasted marshmallows. Not the usual father-son activity you would anticipate. The fire was the only thing visible in front of us by the time the sun had set behind the woods. At that point, The unpleasant sensation had intensified into something more serious. Around 9 p.m., we were roasting s'mores by the campfire when we heard a disturbance. It was like a tree falling with a boom. Suddenly, it was near and loud. Perhaps 100 yards distant, it reverberated through the forest from the river's direction. We snatched up our torches and aimed them toward the noise. But nothing was there. No flashing eyes, no movement. We chuckled nervously as we joked about Bigfoot, but neither of us took it seriously. A few minutes went by. Then it returned, this time louder, further away, but with the same weight and sound. After shining our lights once again, we were only able to see the trees around our tent since the jungle had snatched them away. Then, closer, the third boom. Then the terror struck. Whatever it was, it seemed to be circling the campground as it approached us. Before we could gather our thoughts, the fourth explosion occurred, about 20 yards distant. The actual dread and adrenaline started to kick in at that point. I had long since lost any high I had been getting from the marijuana. My father's eyes widened as he faced me. I could see the terror on his face. We made the decision to enter the tent. In a hurry, we threw the remaining firewood into the fire in the hopes that the flames would frighten away whatever was outside. Then, abandoning everything else, we clambered inside the tent. My dad moved a bit more slowly, but he was close behind me as I dashed inside the tent and fell on the ground, laying flat. The loudest boom came just as he was about to enter the tent. It was so near that it made the earth tremble. My father froze, gazing into the darkness. As he looked in disbelief, I called his name to get his attention, and he hurried inside the tent. "It's standing there," he whispered. I questioned, "What's standing there?" His voice wavered as he continued, "I don't know. It resembled a dark wall." I hid myself beneath my sleeping bag and tried to move as silently as possible as he sat by the zipper. He sat there with a little knife, our sole weapon. We had nothing else, yet it was useless. After that, there was a vibrating sound that is still difficult to describe. It began softly, almost to a buzz, but it was more than simply sound. It permeated the atmosphere. It was an inward sensation that caused our chest to tighten. It's unlike anything I've ever experienced. "You hear that?" said my father in a whisper. I was unable to respond. I just nodded, feeling as if we were being pursued, too terrified to speak. We sat in silence as this continued for around 5 minutes. Then there came this strange sound, which was neither human nor animal. I prefer to describe it as a guttural, alien-like noise. To be honest, I had never heard anything like the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. We remained still in the tent, too terrified to move or breathe. There was a little mesh window next to my bed, but I was afraid of being seen, so I wouldn't peek out. My dad was still sitting there with the knife, and I was just trying to keep my breathing under control. The strangest thing occurred at that point. We just blacked out in the midst of the mayhem. Neither of us recalled attempting to doze off. When we awoke, my dad was still laying in the center of the tent, still holding the knife. In a fright, I woke up on my back, feeling as if something were looming over me. Initially, I wanted to check the time on my phone, but it was dead. My dad checked his, and it was also dead. To ensure we had them operational in case of an emergency, both had been completely charged the previous evening. To urinate, we went outdoors. We saw that it was still completely dark outside as we stood 5 feet away from the tent and peed back to back, still terrified. It was still and frigid. There was nothing at all wrong with the meal we left on the table. As if it had never been touched, the fire we had started before jumping inside the tent had gone completely to ash. We had the uneasy feeling that we shouldn't have been there. In an attempt to obtain some genuine sleep, we spent the night outside in the tent without speaking to one another. We didn't speak until we got into the vehicle, so we packed everything quietly. When we eventually discussed it, we discovered that we had experienced the same sensations that evening, being watched and pursued, as if something were waiting for us to make a mistake. When we returned, we informed my mother. She stated we could have been drugged or ingested some strange gas, and she felt we were insane. However, it wasn't the case. It was genuine, whatever it was that night. The same thing happened to each of us. We still don't know what it was. My dad came the closest, but we didn't see it all. He saw something that wasn't natural or human. Our narrative is unlike any other that we have ever heard. Since then, we have not returned to that spot or even gone camping. We never will, in my opinion. In my early years, it was a yearly custom for my family to spend a weekend in October traveling up to northern Michigan. Up there used to be a 4-acre farm owned by our Uncle Jim. With 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, the home on the land could accommodate a large number of people. My brothers and cousins had 2 bedrooms set up, with our 4 cousins in one room and my brother and sister in the other. All of our parents occupied the other rooms. Uncle Jim has always been an avid fisherman and hunter. He would travel the nation on hunting-specific camping vacations. Despite the fact that he loves animals and would never hurt a fly, my dad has gone camping with him a few times. There was a large area of woodland on my uncle's 4 acres. He painted a number of trees red to demarcate the boundaries of the land. Beyond that, there was just county-owned woodland. The closest residence in that direction was probably miles away, so I'm not sure. While our parents were discussing hunting during lunch, my brother Adam, my cousins Jake and Joe, and I all had an idea. That night, we wanted to camp in the woods. Our fathers supported it. They were more inclined to agree to things since they were undoubtedly already somewhat inebriated. Although they didn't say no outright, our mothers weren't as supportive. The 4 of us were then led into the woods with a tent by my dad and Uncle Jim. Only the lads were participating, not my sister or my female cousins. When the youngest of us, Joey, began to whine that it was too far, they laughed and took us into the woods. Our fathers enjoyed playing tricks on us when we were kids, and that's how they are when they're together, particularly when they're drinking. When it comes to ages, I am the oldest. I was around 13 at the time. Adam and Jake were about 10, and Joe was about 9. There was a tiny space in the woods with a lot of soft, green, mossy-looking things that my uncle called deer bedding. So we crossed the property line. I believe he said that he had previously used it and that it was ideal for a campground. Uncle Jim and my dad kind of gave us a half-drunk tent setting instruction. To ensure that they weren't doing all the work, they forced us to assist. The tent was large enough to accommodate 4 people, including children. We placed our sleeping bags inside when everything was ready. Since it was clearly more simple to conduct this during the day than at night, we chose to do it during the day. Following all of that, we returned home and continued playing outdoors until supper time. Our mothers once again voiced their disapproval of this notion at supper, stating that we were too young to go in the woods by ourselves. Our fathers assured us that everything would be well, and I remember my father joking that if anything went wrong, they would be able to hear our cries since we would be so near. Our fathers didn't lead us back into the woods to the tent until much later. It was chilly at night, so we all brought flashlights and extra blankets. For our game, I also brought a deck of Uno cards. My dad and Uncle Jim departed and returned to the home once we had all settled inside the tent. Suddenly, we were by ourselves in the forest. To be honest, we weren't as near the home as you may have assumed. We were so far into the forest that there was no light visible from the home. We began playing Uno and played for at least 30 minutes. Uno is really a great way to waste time. It's a great way to pass the time. Our flashlights, set up in a circle, illuminated the tent. Everything was going great until we heard a distant scream. It sounded like the scream of a girl. We all became quiet and exchanged identical looks with one another. I then recalled that the cries of foxes resemble the screams of women, so I informed everyone of this. Joe in particular seemed very spooked out, but my comment made everyone feel better. We carried on playing Uno. In fact, I won almost every round. Nobody has brought up the scream again by then. It was probably beyond our comprehension. However, it recurred, this time considerably closer and louder. It sounded much more human this time. We all became quiet once again. I was terrified this time. Joe seemed on the verge of tears. I instructed everyone to switch off their flashlights. After crawling to our sleeping bags, we took a seat in the dark. We all lacked the bravery to dash back to the house through the woods. It's the anxiety that comes with running, being followed, and just drawing attention to ourselves by our footsteps. For some reason, it seemed safer to hide inside a fabric tent. Thus, we silently waited for a long time. We continued to mutter to one another, wondering whether it was still a fox. Sincerely, I said, "I'm not sure." Hopefully. I'm not sure who heard it first, but as we heard extremely quick footsteps approaching the tent while crunching the leaves, we all sprang up and turned to face each other once again. A gut-wrenching, ear-piercing scream that sounded like a girl or woman's scream erupted as they came to a halt. The tent was just outdoors. The tent began to tremble violently. We all began to yell, while my brother and I were yelling things like, "Get out of here!" Jake and Joe were yelling in terror. After I unzipped the tent door, we all hurried into the woods, flashlights in hand, one by one. Only the light from our flashlights allowed us to see anything that ran back to the home. The most tense moment of my life was the sprint back to the home. It seemed like a matter of life or death. Our whole family was already outside in reaction when we arrived at the property, yelling the whole way. We all four returned without incident. Their replies showed that they were all astonished and appalled when we recounted the cries and the shaking of the tent. Then I saw that my sister and our cousins Jamie and Christina were not outdoors. I accused my dad and uncle of sending one of the girls to frighten us, but it became evident that someone we didn't know was in the woods when they showed us that the girls were already in bed. After carrying a few firearms into the woods, our parents came back after some time but discovered no one. We all assisted in moving the tent and other items back to the home the next day. It goes without saying that it was a one-time event. We never again set a camp in those woods. Hell, we stopped playing outdoors after dark. What child would want to go through that? Regarding who was outside our tent and why they were acting in that manner, my estimate is as accurate as anyone's. Sometimes, the woods hold more than just the whispers of the wind or the rustle of leaves. They hide mysteries, fears, and moments that leave scars on the soul. What would you do if someone, or something, was watching you from the shadows? If your sanctuary turned into your worst nightmare, would you have the courage to face it, or would the unknown haunt you forever? These stories remind us that the line between safety and danger can blur in an instant. Have you ever felt the hair on your neck stand up, like you weren't alone? Would you return to the woods after an experience like these? If these tales sent chills down your spine, don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying true stories. Your next camping trip may never feel the same again.